Right now, gardeners around the world are staring at cuttings sitting in clear jars of water. The leaves look healthy. The stems look fine. Nothing appears to be wrong. But underneath the surface, something is quietly being consumed, day after day, hour after hour. And when it's gone, those cuttings just wait. Professional growers figured this out decades ago. Hydroponic facilities use it as standard practice. Commercial propagators apply it routinely. But in the home gardening world, almost nobody talks about it until today. Because I'm going to show you the one substance that fixes this invisible problem completely. It costs less than $2. It's probably already in your medicine cabinet. And when you understand the science behind why it works, you'll never set up a cutting the same way again. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because every week we bring you the kind of real, science-backed growing knowledge that the gardening industry would rather keep to itself. Now let's get into it. Here's something almost nobody thinks about when they set up a cutting in water. What's actually inside that jar? The obvious answer is water. But water is just a carrier. What matters is what's dissolved in it. And one of the most important things dissolved in fresh tap water is oxygen. Most people think of oxygen as something plants need through their leaves. That's true for photosynthesis. But roots are a completely different story. Roots are not passive. They don't simply appear because conditions are quiet and moist. Root formation is one of the most metabolically active processes a plant will ever perform. Every new root cell that forms requires energy. Every root tip that pushes out through stem tissue requires cellular respiration. And cellular respiration, at its core, requires oxygen. This is the part most gardeners never learn. When you place a cutting into a jar of water, that water arrives oxygen-rich. But within a matter of days, the oxygen begins to disappear. The cutting itself consumes it. Microorganisms in the water consume it. And because still water doesn't replenish oxygen the way moving water does, levels drop quietly and continuously. By the end of the first week, the oxygen content of that jar is a fraction of what it was when you filled it. And the cutting's root development reflects that exactly. You've probably seen this without knowing what it was. The cutting sits there looking perfectly alive for 3 weeks, maybe 4. Nothing rots, nothing dies, but nothing happens either. No roots, just waiting. That's oxygen starvation. Not dramatic enough to kill the cutting, but powerful enough to essentially pause root development until conditions improve. Here's what makes this so frustrating. The problem is completely invisible. You can't see oxygen depleting. You can't smell it. The water looks exactly the same on day 7 as it did on day 1. So gardeners blame themselves. They assume they took the cutting wrong. They change the water thinking that's the issue. But unless they understand the root cause, and I mean that literally, they're just guessing. Now, what if you could restore that oxygen directly into the root zone? What if you could flood the exact environment where root cells are trying to form the very thing they need most? That's the question that leads to one of the simplest, most effective propagation tricks available to any home grower. Hydrogen peroxide. When most gardeners hear those words, they think about bleaching hair or disinfecting wounds. It sounds harsh, chemical, aggressive, but at the right concentration, hydrogen peroxide doesn't behave like a disinfectant at all. It behaves like an oxygen delivery system. Here's the chemistry, and I'll keep this simple because the simplicity is exactly what makes it so elegant. Hydrogen peroxide has the chemical formula H2O2. You'll notice it's almost identical to water, which is H2O. The only difference is that extra oxygen atom, and that extra atom is unstable. It wants to break free. When hydrogen peroxide comes into contact with water or organic material, or the enzymes naturally present in plant tissue, it breaks apart, spontaneously, completely, and what it breaks into is water and oxygen. H2O2 becomes H2O plus O. That released oxygen doesn't disappear. It dissolves directly into the surrounding water, into the rooting medium, into the exact space where developing root cells are trying to respire. This is the mechanism. It's not complicated. It's not magic. It's just chemistry working in your favor. The cutting that was sitting in oxygen-depleted water suddenly has access to fresh, dissolved oxygen, and the biological response is immediate. Root cells that were working at reduced capacity begin operating at full speed. The enzymatic reactions that drive root formation, the ones that require oxygen to proceed, accelerate. What was stalled begins moving again. But there's a second reason this works, and it's arguably more important than the first. Even when oxygen levels are adequate, there's another enemy operating in every rooting jar, one that's even more invisible than oxygen depletion. Bacteria and fungi. The moment you place a cutting in water, you create a warm, moist environment, which is exactly the environment that pathogenic microorganisms love. They colonize the water. They colonize the surface of the stem. They attack the cut end, the most vulnerable, exposed tissue on the entire cutting. Often, a cutting doesn't fail because it ran out of energy or patience. It fails because something invisible arrived first.